1996, there was a book written by a man named John Krakauer. And the book that he wrote was called Into Thin Air. It was the account of him being, as a journalist, taken up to Mount Everest. And it was meant to be sort of a documentary account of his journey. Problem is, it became a bestseller due to the fact that this trip became a great tragedy. Mount Everest, as you know, can be a very treacherous place. There is what's called the kind of the death window or something along those lines, which says that by about 2 p.m., you have to start your descent. Doesn't matter if you've made the top. It doesn't matter if you've gotten there. If you haven't started going back down by 2 p.m., that is going to be treacherous for you. They didn't miss the window. The problem is that on this trip, they missed this kind of confluence of storms that was about to attack the mountain in a way that nobody really knew. There were a number of tragedies on that journey. John, the author, obviously lived. That's how he wrote the book. But in his state, he reported about a man named Beck Weathers. Beck was a wealthy guy who has written his own account of the story, so spoiler, he survived. But the problem that he encountered is that about a year or two before that trip, John had what was called a radical keratotomy, which was the early version of laser eye surgery. John's eyes were fixed for the air pressure that we live in all the time down here. What John and his optometrist and all of those didn't know is that as John went into higher levels of the stratosphere, as he got up the mountain, and as the air pressure decreased, that his eyes would fail. And so what was working for him essentially kind of reversed itself and went way worse. And then in the process of him trying to fix his eyes, he wound up scratching one of his corneas pretty badly with an ice crystal. And so Beck Weathers was effectively blind at the top. They tried to lead him for a little while and recognized there was just nothing he could do. He was getting colder and colder. And so they left him there at the top of the mountain to die. It was a tragedy in and of itself until Beck Weathers woke up. He doesn't know how he did. He isn't able to really describe anything about what got him from the point that they left him for dead to the point that he woke up and recognized his one arm could be swung around like a tree limb and he wasn't feeling anything. But he recognized something in that moment that got him up and able to sort of stagger into camp. If you want to read the account of what he looked like at that point, I'll let you. I didn't make it through the account of what he looked like. The pictures are pretty gnarly. Suffice it to say, though, that by the time he actually miraculously made it down and then was airlifted, they had to reconstruct major portions of his face. He lost limbs on both sides, lost toes, and yet survives to this day. The difficulty of trying to use that as an analogy for this passage is actually not as much as you think. Because, as I mentioned last week, this particular text, verses 22 and 23, that focus on the second money metaphor that Jesus gives in the Sermon on the Mount, follows up what we heard last week. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break and steal. Don't treasure, he says, earthly treasure. That's Matthew 6, 19 to 21. Matthew 6 continues, but treasure, heavenly treasure. That was our first metaphor. Lay up for yourselves this kind of treasure. Don't lay up that kind of treasure. That was essentially summed up then at the end when Jesus says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. First metaphor is treasure. The second metaphor that we have has so frequently been pulled out of context so that what Jesus is talking about in verses 19 to 21 and what he's clearly talking about in verse 24 for some folks, seems to have absolutely nothing to do with this passage that we have before us. The eye is the lamp of the body. So if your eye is healthy, your whole body's full of light. But if you have a bad eye, your light's full of darkness. And then we come to the end of verse 23. If your light in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? When Brad preached verses 19 through 24 to us back when we were going through the Sermon on the Mount before, he dealt with all three of these metaphors together, and there was a question of how we were going to do it, and that decision that we made back then affects the way that we're looking at these verses, even though we're looking at them separately today, which is that these texts are also about money. And if we use Jesus' metaphor and allow it to affect the way that we think about what he's already identified as our earthly treasure, we recognize that we can be very much in the same danger that Beck Weathers was when he ascended up into the mountain. Because if we think that being able to see what Michael just talked about as the unseen things, what we saw last week is Jesus saying, fix your eyes on things that are above. If we think that the way we see on this earth is going to also work when we're trying to value what matters eternally, what matters ultimately, and what's valuable up in heaven, then we're going to find ourselves very much in the same kind of danger that Beck Weathers was in. Thinking we can see because our eyes have been attuned to this earth, and then finding ourselves in grave danger. We're going to take this text a little bit out of order today. I want to talk about the problem first. We're going to find that problem in the beginning of verse 23. We're going to call it the fuzzy vision of the bad eye. Then we're going to see the good point, which actually Jesus mentions before that in verse 22, the clarified vision of the good eye, and then thirdly, the grave danger of the darkening eye. The metaphor that's here that really kind of sets the stage for it is right there in the beginning of verse 22, though. We should sort of hit on that first. The eye is the lamp of the body. There was nobody in Jesus' day, just like there's nobody really in our day, who thinks that we have some sort of superpower, heat vision kind of eyes that create light. Honestly, yes, it was an earlier time and medicine wasn't as advanced, but they knew that, all right? What we're dealing with is much like treasure and much like slavery to follow next week, it is a metaphor. This is often, though, the way that the Bible and folks in this, both in Old Testament times and in first century times, would talk about either what is kind of coming into your life through what you see, so the way that an eye functions to either bring in that which is light or to bring in that which is dark. The eyes work that way. And as such, then the eyes are a lamp for the body, bringing in light where there isn't. But there's also a way that sometimes the fact that you can sort of see in somebody's eyes, whether they're sad, whether they're tired, whether they're rejuvenated, you can kind of see that sometimes in people's eyes, right? I mean, we talk about that, people having sad eyes, or just sort of see something in your eyes that's not quite right. Bible speaks both ways about this kind of lamp process. Your eyes sometimes let out for others to see what's going on, but your eyes also bring stuff in. And so the metaphor just kind of works no matter which way the direction of the light is going. We read that something like this in Psalm 119. The law of the Lord is perfect. Hear what it does. It's reviving the soul. The precepts of the Lord are right. They are rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eyes. It's three different ways of saying the same thing. Three ways of talking about God's word, and three ways of talking about the effects of sort of revitalizing us that God's law can have on us. This kind of language is all over there. But what we are going to talk about specifically is a unique way that Jesus is talking about the eyes, and one particular meaning of that metaphor that I hope kind of comes out for us and is going to draw us into one very challenging question. Remember, I told you we were saving a verse for you for this week. It's coming. And here's why it's coming. Let's look at our first point, the fuzzy vision of the bad eye. The eye is the lamp of the body, so here's the first point we're going to look at. Like I said, it's a little out of order. If your eye is bad, the whole body will be full of darkness. Now, the truth is, the same words can often mean this different things. For us, bad kind of functions that way, right? If I said that you were a bad girl or a bad boy, then you would think that I was using bad morally. You had either done the right thing, but not at the right time, that was bad. Or you had done the wrong thing, that was bad. But if I said that the apple has gone bad, you probably aren't going to necessarily think the apple has committed some sort of mortal sin. You just know what I'm talking about. Bad kind of functions that way, and it does here too. But the badness of our eyes isn't really a phrase that seems to imply something that our eyes are doing like morally wrong. In other words, there are plenty of texts that say don't look at pornography. This probably isn't one of it. It's not the primary meaning of this passage right here. Instead, listen to some of the ways that in the Old Testament this phrase of kind of a bad eye is used. Now, the difficulty is most of the times, whenever we actually would see it, we're going to see it translated differently because it's very clunky for us to talk about it. But Deuteronomy 15:9 works this way. If among you one of your brothers should become poor, take care lest your eye look grudgingly on your poor brother. That's probably one of the most direct ways we see it translated over. If you see this poor brother and your eye looks at him badly, if you have a bad eye towards him, well then be careful because you could be guilty of sin based on where your heart's going to lead you in that moment. It's probably the clearest one in terms of how it translates over. But look at Proverbs 23:6. Do not eat the bread of a man who is stingy. Do not desire his delicacies. He's like one who's inwardly calculating. And the proverb goes on and tells you how you'd be in danger if you trust somebody who's stingy, who's giving you the pretense that he's being generous. That phrase, though, a man who's stingy, it actually could be translated a little bit more clunkily, a man whose eye is evil. And so the translators are looking and saying, well, in English, don't look at people with bad, evil eyes doesn't necessarily mean to us what it would. What did it mean as a metaphor back then? And so they bring out this idea of a bad eye means that you're being stingy. Same thing takes place in Matthew chapter 20, where we read, he replied to them, friend, I am doing you no wrong. Now, we're coming in the middle of a parable here. This is Jesus speaking. And he's using the exact same metaphor. You remember the parable, it's a parable of what we call the talents sometimes, right? A guy goes out into the field, he needs to bring in some workers, and he decides that the people he hires at the beginning of the day, and in the middle of the morning, and in the middle of the day, and all the way to the 11th hour, everybody, when they line up to get their wages, gets the exact same wage. Because he told them, come and I'll pay you what's right. And what he decides is right is to be incredibly generous to the 11th hour worker. And if you remember, the people who came at the very beginning would respond exactly the way you would. Well, what's fair about this? He works an hour, I work all day, we all get a day's wage, and here's the response. Friend, I'm doing you no wrong. I choose to give this to the last worker as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? And then here's the phrase. Or do you begrudge me my generosity? That technically would be more like this. Is your eye bad because I'm good? Is there something wrong with the way that you're seeing my generosity? Why is it that you're feeling stingy when I'm feeling generous? You see how the way that a bad eye is being used? It's for that reason that a lot of translators think that Jesus is just borrowing that same idiom, and he's basically saying to us, the eye is the lamp of the body, but if you are stingy, you are bringing a heap of darkness into your world. And if we just think about all the ways that the Bible speaks about both light and darkness, there's just a practical proverbial wisdom to the point Jesus is making so far. If you live your life thinking that what you need to do is to hoard up your resources, then Dickens is going to write a novel about you, or at least a Christmas tale about you, and we'll just call you a Scrooge. And when we meet him, all that we see is that the wisdom of this parable, this particular point, is being played out. He's a darkened guy. He's a shriveled up old man because darkness is cheap, and Scrooge loved it. If stinginess has overtaken you, you're going to find your life to be a lot more dark than you'd really like. That's Jesus' first point. There is a particular danger that is present for those who have these bad eyes, and what it's created is the same dilemma that I had when I was on a trip with Christine this week. We did a bit of a tour in order to see some folks out in Pennsylvania. I visited, sadly, if you've been kind of tracking in any of our prayer requests or any of our prayer meetings, you know we've been praying for one of my friends whose mind has been failing. We visited with him again and recognized he doesn't remember any of the life we shared together. It was hard to be with him. From there we visited with Christine's family. That was delightful. It was great to be able to, a little bit belatedly, but to be able to celebrate 80 years with Christine's mom. That was a real joy to be able to be a part of. That was there. Way to go, Erla. But then Saturday morning, I needed to get up early and travel from where we were in Hershey out to a friend's funeral in Philly. Realized that a friend who's been battling cancer for really essentially about since COVID finally succumbed and he died. To be able to get out there in time and to be able to see another friend before that, I needed to leave about 6 o'clock in the morning. That night, as Christine and I were going to bed, she just said, just be safe. So there was a little bit of a storm that was going to come through, and we had some snow, and I said, I'll be fine. Well, I got up in the morning a little more groggy than I was thinking I was going to, and so 6 o'clock came a lot faster than I thought. My time to get out came a lot faster than I thought, and so I got everything together. Actually, things worked out. But the first 5 minutes of this trip did not feel like they were going to work out. I couldn't find a scraper in our car. And there was the proverbial ice that was on there, and you're trying to figure out. So I'm like, do I use the windshield wiper fluid? Because this is really, really cold. I chose not to. That was wise. But to drive in that condition was less wise. And it was even less wise when I recognized, oh, you moron, your contacts are sitting right next to you on the console. They're not in your eyeballs at this point. And so it is dark. I'm going through a little bit of a snowstorm with a fuzzy sort of vision of what's happening in reality and ice on the windshield. This was not going to go well. Christine had said, be safe. And those words are ringing through my ear. They're going to find my corpse without contacts in. She's going to be like, I knew it. I should have just The good thing is I pulled over to the side of the road. I was able to stop, warm up the car. Things went a little bit. Had to go get some gas and then went and bought an ice scraper and I put the contacts in. But at that moment, I was in more danger than I think I probably want to admit. And I think what Jesus is trying to say to us, it is very possible that we're in more danger than we know. We are descending into a strata of trying to figure out how to handle heavenly treasure. And Jesus is saying, some of you may not have eyes that are even equipped for this right now. You are Paul with scales that need to fall from your eyes because of your fuzzy vision. And so we need to feel that danger, which is why I wanted to look a little out of order, but there is good news. Because the second point is that there can be clarified vision for a good eye. The eye is the lamp of the body. So he says at the very beginning, if your eye is healthy. What he doesn't say is if your eye is good. He doesn't use the basic word for good so that we would think about it kind of morally. He uses a word that's really translated very well here. I'm sure that they're very thrilled that I'm encouraging the way they've chosen to translate this. But most folks would use some sort of a synonym, not around like moral goodness, but around health. If your eye is sound, if your eye is whole, if your eye is kind of singularly focused, then no, things can be great. I've had a few folks in my life who've walked through cataract surgery lately. My dad would tell stories of what it was like to drive, and as it's getting a little bit later in the day and the lights are coming, that it's not so much single lights that he's seeing, but halos around lights. And he's thinking, this is a little dangerous. Well, he goes and gets the surgery, and all of a sudden he recognizes, not only can I see at night, I don't need glasses anymore. They fixed what was fuzzy about my vision, and suddenly everything is just clarified for me in a way that this is really new. Maybe some of you have had this kind of an experience. Proverbs 22. Whoever has a bountiful eye will be blessed. And continuing the metaphor, they define what a good eye, a healthy eye, looks like. He shares his bread with the poor. So the danger is, if you're stingy, you become Scrooge-like in all of your love of darkness. But if something happens so that your eye gets some clarity to it, and you can actually see the world the way that ought to be, then the promise that Jesus gives is, this is going to bring a light into your life. Your whole body will be full of light. Now notice, so far Jesus hasn't told us what to do. Right? The sermon has no command. These are just statements of truth. If you are bad-eyed, if you are stingy focused, you're going to wind up being a dark, shriveled person. But if something happens to clarify your vision, if you can be one of these Proverbs 22 bountifully eyed, blessed folks, sharing what you have with the poor that are right in front of you, a characteristic that it clearly is not new to the Sermon on the Mount. This is something that Jesus is just borrowing from all that God has said in the Old Testament. I desire that when you're going to actually go and plow your field, don't just wring everything out of that sponge. Leave a little space around the edge. Because there's folks in your world that don't have fields, don't have workers. So you leave that for them. That's the lot left for them. This is an Old Testament concept, part of the law that you could be guilty of if you're not abiding by it, because sharing your bread with those who are poor brings a blessing, and it attributes it's kind of showing off the attribute in your life that you are seeing the world the right way. These are just statements so far, no commands. Until Paul. So here's the text. Paul, I think, borrowing all of this language from the Sermon on the Mount, addresses us. It says, Jesus didn't tell you what to do. Here we go. I'm gonna. Guys, this is you. If your mindset in this world is to categorize yourself and say, well, I don't fit that percentage of American life strata, so I'm not probably very wealthy, or I don't have the job I want, I haven't gotten the promotion that I need, I don't have stop it. Stop it, all right? This is your text. The Holy Spirit is going to work this bad boy in you. One of the reasons he's preserved it is for this moment right now. As for the rich, Trinity, this is us. As for us, in this present age, remember we read this last week. This was related to treasure. Charge them not to be haughty, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty. Remember Jesus is saying, right? The eater is going to eat up your stuff. The mothy eater, the rusty eater, the thieving eaters, they'll just take your stuff. So don't put your hopes on the uncertainty of those things. Paul's just borrowing Jesus here. But put your hopes on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. You want your treasure in the right spot, just follow what you're doing with your money, because you'll know whether or not your focus is in the right spot. And this is where I think Paul starts to use a little bit of Jesus' second metaphor. It's not just what you treasure, it is what you are focused on, riveted on, that is going to give you the sense of whether your hopes are in uncertain places or on a God who richly provides everything. The host of the party who just brings out tray after tray after tray so we don't have to hoard stuff. That was last week. The second verse I told you to buckle up for is right here in verse 17 and on. They are to do good. Point one. So how do you know if your hopes are being set on something uncertain or on God who is rich and generous and good and gracious? Are you looking for opportunities to do good and then doing them? Studying them, talking about them, posting about them? Not enough. What are you doing with what you got? That's Paul's first point. Second point, I want your richness not to be in what you hoard up, but in what you create for others. I want your wealth to be in the good works. They are to do good, and they are secondly to be rich in good works. Well, okay, what would that look like? Fine, let's just get there. Be generous. Be generous and ready to share. These are the three things Paul tells us whether or not we've heard Jesus in this sermon. He's warned us in his own language in the beginning of this paragraph, and then as we come into this, he's just said, here's what I want to ask. You are so well equipped to do good, to be rich in good works, and to share what you've got. Are you? And that's what we got to ask. And these are difficult questions to get into because some of us have forgotten the whole principle of stewardship that gets thrown out there. When Jesus talks about our wealth in other places, the metaphor he uses of mastery and stewardship puts us not in the category of owner, ever in the category of ownership. We are the ones entrusted with what belongs to someone else, with what we've then taken to be a caveat and said, well, okay, clearly you've given a lot to me, but we know the standards I have to live by, and so the question is, what percentage of that did you want to be for your work? And what percentage of that is supposed to be for the maintenance of your steward and his world? This is a big question for us. Because we, the wealthiest ever, have become some of the stingiest ever if we just think about the percentages of what are entrusted to us. We have become the kind of people that will begrudgingly do good, that will maybe, be 10%ly rich in good works, or that will be marginally generous, but mostly ready to hoard. And Paul said, you gotta ask some hard questions of yourself. What happened that my stewards thought that everything I gave them was supposed to be spent on them? What happened when a church thought that everything that it received was supposed to go into its own benefits and its own building? These are hard questions that we have to ask because we do know that God has placed us as stewards in a society that's expensive to live in. We've planted a church in a community that is relatively, well off. And so if you're going to reach out into this community, we told you, we tried to do that one thing where we put out some postcards to people. It cost a lot more money than we were comfortable with. But how do we balance these things? It would be easy for me to stand up and give platitudes that create guilt and let that guilt motivate you. I just never think that fear really generates love, given the fact that God says there's no fear in love. But wisdom, I think that would be great. Honest evaluation of ourselves, I think that would be great. I think spending some time really praying, really talking, and asking some hard questions of our what we save for, what we store for, what we actually think needs to be done in this world, that we should probably ask some good questions for and say, Lord, I don't have wisdom. I don't want earthly wisdom. I want wisdom from above, and I want to have faith that you're going to give it to me. I think that makes a lot of sense. Because the promise of that is that we won't waste our lives and waste our money. Instead, the promise that he puts out here is that if we do these three things, doing good, being rich in good works, being generous and ready to share, then we will be, he says, storing up treasure for ourselves as a good foundation for our future. Why? Because here's what we think. We think we know what life really is, and we think we know what life really costs. We think that to actually have a good, successful life, we've got to respond to the ad that I remember seeing when Christine and I were first trying to ask a question of moving out of a house and into, or out of an apartment and into a house. There was an ad for a guy who would build houses and factories and come and put them on your site. And at the top of it, it said, "Live the American dream." And I remember seeing that house and thinking, that's living right there, man. I mean, if we could live there, that would be truly life. And Paul says, no. Do everything I said so that they may take hold of that which is truly life. Guys, living in this world is like those boats sailing through the ocean where the barnacles just start getting attached more and more and more, and they're causing drag, and they're making us veer off course. And every now and then, you just got to get up out of the water. You just start peeling these things off. Every now and then, we got to get ourselves away from this world that we've been living in, and we got to say, Lord, would you just peel the scales off of my eyes so that I could see freshly one more time, so that I could be unencumbered by what has been happening, because I've been storing up for myself for a future that apparently I'm not even going to be a part of. I'm not going to be a part of this world. What am I storing up all my treasure for? This world's good then. But Lord, I could be good. I could do good works. I could be rich that way and generous this way. And then I could store up for myself a good foundation for the future. And Paul's like, yeah, that's what Jesus meant in the Sermon on the Mount anyway, guys. That's why he said, don't treasure earthly treasure. That's why he said, instead, treasure heavenly treasure. And then ask good questions of where your heart is in the process. You find yourself having trouble praying for things? Well, are you giving to them? Are you being generous towards them? The promise is this: you start giving towards something, you're going to pray for it a lot more. They go together, and Paul's just saying, just be a part of it. But then the greatest, this is our third point, the gravest danger we can experience is that of a darkening eye. I told you my dad needed the surgery because he could look and see I'm not seeing right. Seen that old video clip of the two women? They are older women driving down their car, and the one plows right through the roundabout and then hits it like a cart. And the other lady says, "Are you aware that you just ran over some people and ran through a red light and went through a roundabout?" And the other looks and goes, "Am I driving?" So many of us that are like that. We're living this life forgetting that we're actually behind the wheel. We're actually making decisions. Life isn't being handed to us. Values aren't being handed to us. We're actually steering this thing. And our vision isn't what we think it ought to be. And if we think we are seeing clearly when we're not, then the moment of great darkness could be upon us. Jesus says it this way: if the light in you is darkness, then that's a real problem. How great is that darkness? Guys, it's very possible that you've been having kind of a a Christmas and Easter sort of vision for generosity. You've ever heard that phrase used for when people come to church, right? They're C&E Christians. They come at the holidays. And maybe you think that way about generosity. You think about it whenever, you see the guy out, he's ringing the bell, and you put something in, or somebody mentions something to you, and you ask the question of, how am I generous? Well, I'm generous when the moments arise, right? The Christmas and Easter moments, the times when generosity is there, when we hear, oh, this is what's going on in Nepal, would you give to that? And you say, oh, okay, I can give to that. And those are good moments, but they might not describe the patterns. We may be more stingy than we're aware. Our eyes may be worse than we're aware. In one of those nice parts of this trip, we were hanging out with Christine's niece, and I was on computer, sort of doing some work, sort of screwing around, and she comes over and she's like, "What are you looking at?" I was like, "Oh, Gracie, I'm looking at Facebook Marketplace." She's like, "Why are you looking to buy a suitcase and a pickup truck and a lawnmower and an engine?" I said, "Because Facebook knows the stuff that I want. That's what I've been looking for. I was thinking about a suitcase. I was thinking about a pickup truck. I was thinking about how I was going to fix that engine in my lawnmower so that I could mow things again." And Facebook's like, "We know." And so I scroll down a little while, and they're like, "Hey, what about this engine?" I was like, "Oh, I thought I forgot about that engine." They're like, "No, we remember." And it was sort of embarrassing, sort of revealing. Gracie, in that moment, got a snapshot of Darren's eyes, what he thinks about. Now, this may incredibly be boring, and I think it's just one of those, hey, your pastor got old. He's thinking about lawnmower engines and pickup trucks and suitcases. But here's where Jesus goes next. Spoiler. Nobody gets to serve two masters. You either hate one and love the other, or you're devoted to one and despise the other. You can't serve God and money. John, sitting there in this sermon, later says it this way: "This is the judgment. The light has come into the world, and people loved the darkness rather than the light because their works were evil." There's a way to go through this world with really dark vision and really shriveled bodies and love it until it's too late. And praise God, Jesus has woken us up again through the power of the Spirit, giving us this passage, reminding us of this sermon, and giving us this analogy one more time so that we can remember He didn't let us stay there. He doesn't let us live there. He perpetually calls us out of the darkness and into the light. How? By Him absorbing all of that on Himself. By Him taking the credit for every errant, selfish, and stingy decision we've ever made. It was laid on His shoulders so that we could be free of it once more. That's why we can read, "You are a chosen race. You are a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for His own possession, so that you can proclaim the excellencies of Him who did what? Who called you out of that darkness and into His marvelous light." And I got to say that He's doing it again right now. I don't have a thing for you to give to. This isn't a ramp up for a project. We're not going to ask you for some money so that we can put a third wing onto the building. That'll be next year. When all those guests that you've invited are showing up. I just want you to do this. Pray this prayer. "Oh Lord, You have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down, when I rise up, You discern my thoughts from afar." That's the beginning of Psalm 139. It's not 23, 24, it's 1 and 2. Here's 23, 24. So Lord, The beginning of the psalm says, you have searched me, you have known me. Here's the end of it, and I'm just daring you to pray this again this week. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts, and see if there be any grievous way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. That's the prayer. That's it. There's nothing to give to, nothing to do next. Just pray this and see. See the generosity he leads you to. See the good works that he has stored up in advance for you. See the good you could do with all you've got. Last week we asked, what treasure do I treasure? Here's your question for this week. What scales keep me from seeing God's goodness and generosity? Because you know what you're going to see when the scales come off? Not everything you've got to do and give away, but everything you've received from your generous God. And it's seeing him that changes us again and again and again. So let's pray. Father, we want to be these generous people. But we recognize how quickly our eyes scale over. And Lord, like my Facebook Marketplace page, if there are moments in this church that are happening right now where we are seeing a little bit more freshly what we care about because we've got these dim, fuzzy, scaly eyes, then I pray, Lord, as you have in the past, would you peel the scales from our eyes one more time? Would you help us not to see you as stingy? Would we see you as generous? And then would our eyes be good because you are good? May we see your great, generous kindness. May we see your unending grace and your daily provision. And would seeing you let light into our bodies one more time. Would our self-deception fall away? Would your Spirit's correction be real? And as those with clarified vision, could we see the poor? Could we see the needs? And could we see the path that you have channeled for us to get to them? Knowing that the great divide has already been bridged by Christ who came to us. We pray this in his mighty name. Amen.